go back to the slides. Okay, the next, actually, the next thing, we want to get down to some real work. Kind of outstanding business. Talk about the MCP revisions that, as you remember, the PFAS stuff went online, went final at the end of December, but we have a lot of other provisions that we had put aside while we were working on PFAS, and now we're continuing to do that as we sit at home. So Liz will take this, and I'll pull up your slides for that. I think it's this one. Nope. I think it is. Oh, there are more. No wonder. Not that one. I have way too many things open. What does it look like? It looks like that. Ba, 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 ba. There we go. All right. So you should see MCP amendments discussion March 26, 2020. Yes?
Yes.
All right, Liz, take it on.
Am I unmuted?
Yes, you are.
Okay. So thanks, Paul. So I have put these items all on 2 pages, and what Paul and I planned on doing was I would talk through a few of them at a time and then take a pause and take any questions. So Paul, just for your reference, I think I'll try to get through 1 through 5. So what I have in this table here are some pre-final decisions that we've made on how we want to finalize the public hearing draft, so the final amendments. And we had a discussion back in January that focused on risk characterization provisions. So Nancy Bettinger had talked about exposure point concentrations and the proposals related to waste or coal tar at sites, and that information, the slides from that meeting are on our Waste Site Cleanup Advisory Committee page. So today I'm not going to focus on those, but some other items which I think are among the more significant ones. And some of these will sound familiar to you because we have talked about them before in terms of the comments we received on these different items. So I just want to give you an idea of where we think we're headed on them, but at the top of the slide, and as Paul mentioned, is if you have comments on what you hear that don't get brought up in the discussion today, please feel free to email me directly or send it to BWSC regulations, because if there is something additional you want us to consider with respect to what I'm saying, we're still open to hearing that. I just want to kind of give you an idea of how we're starting to settle on these things. So first, in terms of the effective date of the amendments, we're planning on having the bulk of the amendments effective 4 months from the publication date. That's a little more time than we usually give. I think typically we do 2 months or 3 months from the publication date. We're trying to be responsive to people's comments in particular related to adjusting to changes in the risk characterization related to exposure point concentrations. The reportable concentrations will go into effect on the date that the regulation is published. And you'll have the option of using the new Method 1 standards from the point of time from the publication date, because we have the ability to publish those as Method 2 standards. So we've done that previously, where you have the ability to use either the existing or the soon-to-be new standards during that period of time. In terms of the numeric standards and the reportable concentrations, we're finalizing those values as proposed. One holdover item from the risk characterization discussion was what we were going to do to address the potential acronym confusion for introducing upper confidence limit term into the MCP for exposure point concentrations. So what we're planning on doing is changing upper concentration limits to method 3 ceiling limits, or ceiling limits for short. We had some suggestions of using upper bound concentrations or upper ceiling concentrations, and we toyed with that one for a while because we liked the use of UC for those concentrations, but in the end we decided to go with the ceiling limits for that term. Item 4, there was a proposal to reintroduce a limitation on conducting release abatement measures at disposal sites when an immediate response action was required or ongoing. That had been a provision that we had in the regs previously and had dropped out at some point. And so in the public hearing draft, we proposed putting that back in. But we got comments, questions about the implementation of that, whether that really was appropriate if the immediate response action and the release abatement measure weren't in conflict with one another, kind of defining the area of the site where that would apply. So it seemed to raise more questions than it would provide benefit, and we decided to withdraw that proposal. Another proposal we had related to release abatement measures was to add text that would say when you're doing a construction related RAM, you should do pre-characterization to the extent feasible related to that project. And we got questions about or concerns about introducing the ambiguity of to the extent feasible, and that interfering with people's judgment in terms of how to manage their projects. I think we had really intended that as a consideration. So we are proposing to modify that to make that clear, that that's a consideration consistent with training we've done on construction related RAMs, but to remove the to extent feasible language in there. So I think I'll take a break here. Paul, if you could see if there are if anyone wants to ask a question or make a comment.
Sure, open it up. No, everybody's happy with it. All right.
I'm sorry. I have one comment, Liz.
Yeah.
Just it's not a big deal. But on the method 3 ceiling limits, we now have a new acronym confusion, MCL.
Oh,
yeah.
I'm
So
just saying,
that's a good point. So let's go with CL.
Okay.
Or ceiling limits.
That would be fine. That would be fine. But, because people are going to shorten it to MCL, and then you got other MCLs, and then, yeah. CL would be good.
Yeah, who could have seen that coming?
Yes, we're with the MCP and its length, we're really running low on available acronyms. That is a problem.
Although you could do M3CL.
That's right.
yeah. Revert, and then you could call it MECL because 3 is instead of an E. Yeah. No. CL. We'll go with CL. Liz wanted CL anyway. I think I was saying method 3. Ceiling limits, but.
Hi, this is Cindy Fuller, and I just have a real quick question from Sovereign Consulting. Can you clarify for the exposure point concentration portions of the proposal, are those being implemented now, or do you have a date or any expectation of when those things kick in?
So no, they're not being implemented now. That would be that would be a provision that would be 4 months from the publication date. So if you go back up to item 1, the effective date of the amendments, that would be 4 months from the publication date.
And is there any publication date specifically for those implementing those EPC changes?
We don't know what our publication date's going to be at this point. So we still have the process ahead of us of finalizing the draft, the final regulations internally, and sending it up through the Executive Office of Environmental Affairs, getting their approval, getting it to the Secretary of State's office for publication. So, so we won't know that. We'll be updating everyone as we proceed as to what the publication date and the effective date will be.
Okay, so for the time being, the 2014 exposure parameters and recommendations for EPCs stand until we hear
Yes.
otherwise.
The current regulations are in effect until the publication date, when the reportable concentrations will go into effect, and then 4 months after that date for everything else.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Okay, Lisa Camp raised her hand.
I know, it's kind of a shocker. Just to follow on with those questions, am I inferring correctly that DEP does not intend to issue a public comment draft again that actually has the language, the draft language for all these changes? Because things like what Nancy presented at the previous meeting regarding the risk assessment stuff, it was on a conceptual level, and a lot of the, I think, the devil's in the details. So I just was curious if there's any, prospect that DEP would put out the actual draft language for comment.
It hasn't been our intention to put out draft language before we finalize the draft.
Okay, well, I was sort of hoping, at least for those changes, that would be a potential option, because like I said, it was at a very conceptual level, and I think some of the issues on when and how to calculate things, such as the 95% UCLs, et cetera, are important technical issues. So if there's any potential for at least some of those pieces to have a draft circulated, even for a short time, I think a lot in the community, a lot of us would appreciate it.
Okay, we will definitely take that back and take that under consideration. I will say, in the redrafting of those provisions, one thing we did focus on was introducing a lot of flexibility in terms of how they're applied. So we did make a lot of changes along those lines, but we'll take that up in terms of whether we would have limited language out there for people to take a look at.
Yeah, one thing I would kind of differentiate. I think we're still working within the what was put out for public comment and kind of reaction to the comments that we got back. I think what we're thinking about into the in January, we were still working on the actual language, so we couldn't have presented much more than the conceptual approach. As we get closer to having the final language ready, I think one where we believe that it certainly falls within changes kind of within the scope of what was already proposed. So I don't think we would need to go out for official formal public comment. So I'll take your request, Lisa, as kind of running it by, similar to talking about it at another advisory committee meeting, but with more specific language up on the screen to react to.
Okay, Thanks, Paul.
I'd second Lisa's point, just in the sense that if there are places, and I don't recall how many places there are, so I apologize for that, but if there are places where there's brand new language, even though you folks are trying to achieve the same objectives we are, just by looking at it from the other side of the table, sometimes the wording choices are different. And I like Paul's idea of not stretching this out too long and trying to come up with some informal way to just get some, as much as anything else, drafting suggestions rather than conceptual or direction of the ship suggestions to end up in the best place.
Okay, so you want me to scroll down if there's nobody else raising their hand?
Okay, so Paul, I think the next 6, 7, and 8 I want to cover together.
Okay.
So 6, 7, and 8 are all related to active exposure pathway mitigation measures for vapor intrusion. The first is related to the definition. We had a definition that focused on really subslab depressurization systems, and the comment was made that it should be expanded to also include positive pressurization systems, which is consistent with how we described the options in the vapor intrusion guidance. So we have made a change to include that. However, we're concerned about those systems in terms of supporting permanent solutions. They are not really the straightforward subslab depressurization systems, the simple systems that we envisioned in terms of allowing for a permanent solution ongoing. So what we are proposing to do is, in the case where they're used to support a permanent solution, we would require that those systems have continuous monitoring of the system. Just to note, I don't think we have any of these right now in terms of being registered as active exposure pathway mitigation measures. So it's not a common scenario, but where if it were to come up, we would require that those systems have continuous monitoring. Item 7, we had proposed, this is really, item 7 is what we proposed, and we're intending to finalize it as we proposed it, which is require that going forward that items measure pressure and give us notifications based on pressure outside the range of the operating regimen rather than shutdown and restart of the system. But we would recognize or grandfather those systems that are already in place supporting permanent solutions that are measuring shutdown and restart. And then item 8, in general, our feeling is that we want to move more towards continuous monitoring of these systems. We propose that as an option, and we're going to finalize that. It will remain as an option. It's written as where someone's going to move towards continuous monitoring, that they would do that upon approval by the department. One change we made is to change that from or to clarify that that would be subject to a presumptive approval. That was one of the suggestions that was made. But we also want to incentivize getting people to move toward that. And so we're looking to eliminate the need for remedial monitoring reports in the case where that's used to support temporary solutions and remedy operation status. And Paul will stop there for questions.
Okay, anybody? Any questions, comments? Okay, I might just start randomly unmuting people and putting them on the spot.
Don't do that.
Okay, do you want to move on?
Sure. So I think I'm going to take 9 and 10 together. So tier classification extensions, we had proposed that where submittals are being made, being made on time, that represents that the site is still engaged, and in such cases we wouldn't require a separate tier classification extension. So there are different ways to describe that, but one way to think of it is that it just stays the need for submitting a separate tier classification extension. And we want to go forward with that proposal, finalize that. If the party doing the work is new, you would still need a tier classification transfer, or an eligible person could still come in for separate deadlines. But assuming that the party doing the work remains the same and they're meeting their submittal requirements, there's no need for a separate tier classification extension. Item 10, I think this is probably one of the bigger departures from what we proposed, and it was based on comments and additional internal discussion. We had proposed annual status reports for sites in temporary solution where they weren't conducting active operation and maintenance of a remedial measure or conducting remedial actions. And we proposed that those would come in annually unless the party proposed a separate, a different frequency for submitting those reports, including up to every 5 years, which is lines up with the periodic evaluation they're required to do on temporary solution sites anyway. And what we're proposing to do is flip that around so that it's not on the party doing the work to establish the frequency of those reports or to submit those annually, and instead give the department the ability to, upon written notification, set up a different frequency for those reports. So to give us one more tool where it may come up, or we may see the benefit of doing that at certain sites. It's kind of akin to the language that we have where we say upon notification by the department, we would let you know whether we wanted to be specifically approve a comprehensive response action or an assessment plan. So just give us the ability to do that notification and set up a different frequency for reporting in those cases where we have a reason to think that would be beneficial. I'll stop there.
Silence.
Liz, this is Steve Sharon. Could you just go over again that last point you made about DP notification of a different schedule or frequency? So would the regulation be set up that you would automatically have that 1-year reporting frequency or the 5-year one, and then unless we receive correspondence from you indicating a different schedule?
I think it would be set up, and that we would not have any language about an annual status report. And that's what we had proposed, but that for these sites, the reporting, if they're not doing any active O&M or remedial actions, there aren't any annual status reports. There aren't reports required other than the 5-year periodic evaluation, unless we would notify the party and establish one separately.
Liz, it's Larry. Do you have any
Okay.
sense on what would, I'm sorry. It's Larry. Do you have any sense on what would drive DEP to want to do it more frequently? I mean, what situations you were thinking of?
Well, we have a general, we have a general sense that over time, we've had a lot of sites end up in temporary solution where work isn't being done. Sometimes we know that some monitoring is being done, but we're not getting those results. Sometimes there are situations in terms of the status of the site and what's holding them up from moving forward, where we may want to have the ability to get at that information or engage with the person who has the temporary solution status and find out about this. So there are cases where we would want to re-engage with them, and sometimes it's difficult when the next thing required of them is 5 years away, and we have other tools we might use, but this would give us a more direct way to engage with those sites. If any of the regional staff want to add to that about circumstances, please do.
I'll join in with one. And I think this is kind of what I would view as kind of perhaps an obvious one. Now that we're well into the MCP, and we've had multiple, for some sites, multiple 5-year review periods, and I think one sadly not uncommon, not that frequent, but not uncommon situation is that some PRPs achieve their temporary solution. They know that there's this 5-year review, but a year into it, 2 years into it, they tend to forget that. And it comes as a surprise to them at 5 years or at 5.5 years or 6 years when DEP comes looking for the 5-year review, and they haven't done it yet. So one example would be in cases where we find that people are not kind of keeping up with that review, and we have reason to believe that a more frequent checking in would benefit them, keep the fact that they have ongoing obligations closer to the front of their mind, that a more frequent check-in, whether it's every 2.5 years, whether it's every 2 years, whether it's every year, might be appropriate for a particular case. So I could certainly see a situation where somebody that has trouble remembering about the 5-year reviews might be asked to be on a more frequent schedule.
Hey, Paul, this is Rebecca Buswell.
Hey, Rebecca. Rebecca, do you want to mention who you are and what your role is?
Certainly. I am the audit section chief in the Central Regional Office. So I would like to echo what you and Liz have both said about temporary solutions, formerly known as C1. We have a lot of sites where, and I'd say maybe 10 or 20% in the Central region that are in this category where they've really just fallen off the wagon altogether for some reason or another. That 5-year period comes and goes and we don't hear a peep. And it's really a long period of time where staff changes in the private sector, and when you only have one report that needs to be done every 5 years, it's something that they forget to tell the next person that is taking over their position, that there's this long-term responsibility to MassDEP. So we find a fair percentage of these just kind of fall off the wagon. So I applaud these changes to the regulations that allow us an opportunity to kind of set tighter deadlines where necessary. So thank you for that.
Okay, Matt Hackman. Matt, do you want to unmute? You had a comment?
Yeah, I just to answer Larry's comment, and this site involved the issues that you and Rebecca just discussed as well, and Mr. Johnson is familiar with it. But I will say that Larry, I had a C1 RAO site that in 2012 that transitioned to temporary solution looking for no monitoring until the 5-year PRO. And it, among things, was a former plating site. The issue was primarily cadmium in groundwater above UCLs that pushed it into temporary solution. We had TCE historically, but over years and years of sampling, it never had an issue. And when finally the PRO sampling was done, TCE results had jumped. Concentrations in groundwater had jumped by 100-fold, and in soil vapor 1,000-fold, and were as high as 135 micrograms per cubic meter in indoor air, creating an imminent hazard. How this happened, where it had, why it happened, there didn't seem to be any source in the intervening years, but you know, the change in condition was dramatic. And you know, one of the things that's worrisome to me is the last data I have is from late 2011, actually, and until 2019. And how long were those people being exposed to that TCE in indoor air? So I think I'm a convert.
And I think it's important. I mean, what we did switch is the presumption element that you know, it's 5 years unless, you know, we have reason to believe and we think it's important to do something more frequently. So we would be in contact with them, and rather than have it the other way around. Lisa Kemp, again, politely raising her hand.
Oh, I don't know why I did that. I actually wasn't.
Okay, I lowered your hand for you.
Thank you.
Now I'm going to mute you again. Okay, any other comments? Hey, Liz, you want to finish up?
Okay, so there are 3 more items I wanted to highlight, and I'll go through the 3 and break again for questions. So the GPS locations for monitoring wells, we had proposed, we would like to get this information about GPS well locations electronically so that it's available to us and eventually could be made available to everyone. We think it will really be a benefit, and we can foresee having this information mapped and people more able to readily access groundwater quality information if we were to go forward with this requirement. So we're proposing to go forward with it, but kind of control the rollout or implementation of it by specifying that we would require it to be reported on a form provided by the department for such purposes. We use that language throughout the MCP now. So unless and until we have that, that form available, we can kind of work toward that. But until the time that we've kind of have that available and we point to it and ask people to start to use that, if it takes us some time to get up and running with that, we can control the implementation of it. One thing that we're doing is coordinating this with the well driller program. Under their regulations, they already require that well drillers report GPS locations for some monitoring wells. They are also undergoing revisions to their regulations now. So we want to work with them as well as LSPs on how to roll this out. We want to have the same specifications in terms of accuracy for the GPS location. So I guess that's a long way of saying that we want to go forward with this. It may take some time to get it up and running. In the meantime, we would encourage people to start including this in their reports. if they have a table where they provide the GPS locations, to start doing that. And also work with your well drillers in terms of finding out whether or not they're reporting this information as they're currently required to do under the well driller program. The next item, notice to affected individuals when immediate response actions are being conducted to address an imminent hazard or critical exposure pathway. We had a comment about the requirement to post notices in these cases in multi-unit buildings, and the concern was that these notices, especially if you had a large building where the immediate response action and the exposure concern was limited to one corner of a shopping mall was one example given, that providing this notice would potentially be raising alarm bells to people that really weren't at any risk or from the activity or the exposure in that building. So what we would like to do to address that concern is to modify the BWSC 124 form to allow for more effective risk communication and additional narration about what activities are occurring and where the potential exposure concern may be. And also make it clear that there is flexibility in terms of where the posting should be made and that it should be most proximate to the location where the immediate response action activities are occurring. When we developed those transmittal forms, the BWSC 124, we had put those out for comment, and we worked with the advisory committee and others to revise those forms. So we would intend to go through the same process of getting your assistance in making changes to that form to make it a better risk communication tool. And then finally, I wanted to mention the climate change provisions. We had proposed that consideration of the potential impact of climate change at the disposal site and in terms of the disposal site remedy be taken into account. One of the comments we got was to consider whether or not we should put a time frame in the regulations about what period of time into the future people should consider. We think that was a good comment. However, because this is an area where guidance is under development and still changing, I think we feel more comfortable leaving that to the guidance and to best practices that are under discussion right now. One change we do want to make is to make clear that the assessment in terms of potential climate change impacts should be based on information that's made available by the state. There was some concern that we were looking for people to be conducting their own research in terms of the impacts of the site, and we want to make it clear that that's not the case. So Paul, I think if you want to open it back up to questions.
Okay. Any questions on the last three or any of them before that?
This is Larry. Liz, the objection that we had to the GPS language was that it was tied into the definition of monitoring well, which didn't make any sense at all. Did you move that to some other place and keep
Yes.
this of it? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Thanks, Larry. Thanks for mentioning that. So we actually had put it into the definition as just a placeholder, and we've moved it into the well maintenance and security. I think that's what that section is called, 40.0028 section. So it's now called well geolocation, maintenance, and security, or something to that effect. And that's where we that's where we address that the geolocation of the well should be provided.
Great. Thank you, Liz.
Liz, this is Susan. I appreciate the climate change provisions being clear that we're using information from the state. I think that's good. I think EOA is going to put out a lot of good information as they are under the MVP program. But I am concerned that the guidance that would drive this would follow quickly. Sometimes we have a tendency for the guidance to lag years. And as we all know, assessing climate change 5 years out, 10 years out, 20 years out, 30 years out, totally different picture, and would necessitate totally different controls in remedy selection, et cetera. So I just want to make a point that I think it's really important that we follow quickly with guidance on that.
Point taken.
Thank you.
I just had a quick comment on the climate change issue as well. I echo Susan's sentiment that we definitely need some guidance to follow quickly, because we're already seeing the effects of a lot of these issues, especially on the coastline. And I would hope that the guidance also takes into account looking at different compounds of concern and timeframes, or the timeframes relative to those compounds of concern. When you have something that's more persistent as far as time, then the time frame needs to be longer, and that needs to be addressed on a case by case basis. And then my last question or request is just to, in addition to this whole recording being made available, perhaps you could send out this this PDF of the summary of changes to the group.
Yes, we will. We can. It's small enough we can send it out to the group, but it will also be posted on the advisory committee page along with the link to the video, so you can pick it up there. That probably will be this afternoon, depending upon how quickly the video generates from Zoom.
All right, thank you.
Anything else? Any other questions about the MCP revisions?